Record.
Magalhael to Stokes, who's onside. 1-0.
Here's Sims. It's a good serve this from Southampton. They could finish the job here. It's Shane Long, and he has done it. Just a minute to play. That's stoppage time. Here's Letizia. Oh, better to say farewell than one of the finest players ever to wear the red and white.
Hello and welcome. You have reached episode 111 of the Saints FC podcast. I'm John Bailey. I'm here with you once again. And opposite me on my laptop screen in faraway lands across the country are Mr. Tom Parker, of course. Tom, how are you?
Been good, but frustrated, but we'll come to that.
Yeah. And Mr. Alex Stewart, who you may remember from, I don't know, like episode 97 or something, slightly happier times, I feel. Alex, you may remember from our episode, it was episode 102, but you may also recognise his voice from the marvellous Tifo videos and Tifo podcasts. Alex, it's really good to have you back on the podcast and, shining light in probably what is going to be otherwise dismal week, month, season for Saints fans. So welcome back, Alex.
Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. I was sort of so flustered by our change in audio recording software in the start. I didn't even bother saying thank you for joining us. So thank you for joining us again, Alex. Alex, if people like hearing your voice today and they want to hear more or understand more about you, what should they do? Where should they go?
They should, I suppose the easiest way is to check out Tifo on Twitter. So that's Tifo Football _. That's where we put out the videos, which I write some of, and also where the Tifo Football podcast lives, which you can also find on Spotify and all the usual things. So yeah, that's me.
Okay, great. So what have we got? Well, I was a little bit ill with a cold for 2 weeks, so I haven't recorded an episode for 3 games now. Obviously, we've got one very, very important game to talk about, which is the FA Cup semi-final. And Tom, I may get you to mention the games against Burnley and West Bromwich Albion, although probably the less said about West Brom game, the better. I didn't actually see the Burnley game, so I might want a 2-minute word from both of you chaps on that, because I missed that one. It probably sounds like the only decent thing that's happened for Saints. But I want to start with the FA Cup semi-final, if that's okay. So obviously, really big opportunity for Saints to make some history, the players to go down in history. We know this is a group of players that can beat any team that's put in front of them on their day. We've beaten the likes of Man City, Liverpool, Chelsea in Ralph's time. And we're up against Leicester, a team who are doing well this season, who have thrashed us, but we've beaten them since. So, it was a pretty good opportunity. And I think probably if we go back all the way to episode 102 and the way Saints were playing last time we spoke, Alex, things that back then, if you said that Saints would be in an FA Cup semi-final against Leicester, you'd be feeling pretty confident about it, I think, if we go back to those sort of heady days.
Yes, I think you would then. Obviously expectations going into the tie itself were considerably more tempered by recent performances. And I suppose the weird thing is it's hard to know exactly what has gone wrong beyond the absences, beyond the fact that key players have been unavailable for key games. Obviously, Romeo's been out for a considerable amount of time, and it feels like the team is not knitting together in quite the same way that it was. So, yes, I think back then in those heady days when we were we were top for a 24-hour period and all the rest of it, we'd have been licking our lips at this prospect. But no, I was expecting nothing less than a defeat, if I'm honest.
Tom, were your feelings the same?
I disagree. So I think, John, you mentioned we'll start the FA Cup final, but FA Cup semi-final, but I don't think you can talk about the FA Cup semi-final without looking at the West Brom game. Because for me, Like make no mistakes, the West Brom game was the worst Southampton performance for years. I think it was genuinely flummoxingly terrible. Probably up there with the Everton game after the post 9-0. Now, but what I felt afterwards when I thought about it, I was like, well, Ralph's done a couple of things here. He doesn't have really, does he? He doesn't have a kind of alternative 11. Like generally outside of swapping Adams for maybe Redmond or maybe Walcott, the team kind of names itself. And those players know that no matter what they do, Danny Ings can not score for 15 games. He's going to start. Carl Walker-Peters is always going to be right back. And I felt that maybe the players were like, well, we've got an FA Cup semi-final. This is a dead run against West Brom. There's nothing in this game. Let's not run ourselves into the ground and ping a hamstring or get sent off or do something stupid. And therefore, they'll go hell for leather against Leicester. And, I couldn't have been further from them. I couldn't have been more wrong.
Yeah, I mean, the game against West Brom made me want to sort of weep in terms of just how bad it was. But you sort of had that, oh, well, there's the semi-final around the corner. But to be honest, like Alex, I just didn't really expect us to get anything from the game against Leicester. I was a little bit worried that, if things went wrong quickly, we'd suddenly be staring down the barrel of a really awful, humbling, with a big score. So I was sort of pleased that we managed to keep things tight-ish. But yeah, my expectations were pretty low as well. Should we just sort of like meander our way quickly through the main, focal points of the match, and then let's have a bit of a wider discussion at the end. I think probably the first thing of note for Saints was Diallo getting an early yellow card, and we know that Saints deep line midfielder getting an early yellow card doesn't normally work out particularly well for Saints, because it means we have a little bit less bite in the tackles, and I think Romeo is like certainly a different player when he has a yellow card than when he's not got a yellow card, although he always manages to avoid turning it into a red. That was maybe the first thing that I thought maybe had an impact on the game. What did you guys think?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, Southampton rely on intensity, and I think particularly when you're up against Leicester, who I know they didn't start Maddison in this game, but when they have that three of Maddison, Tielemans and Ndidi, I think that's in some ways one of the best balanced midfields in the Premier League. So you need to have the ability to press hard, you need to be intense, you need to be right up against them and preventing them particularly from Tielemans, from playing those passes from deep. I have to say, I think Diallo was probably lucky that the challenge was as early as it was, because there's certainly, I mean, we have a little Tifo WhatsApp group when we were all watching games together, and there was certainly a consensus that had that been later on in the game, it could potentially have been a straight red. I think it was pretty reckless, and I can understand his enthusiasm. He's had a run of games, but this is arguably the biggest fixture that he's played for the side so far. But I thought it was a bit silly, and like you say, it did rob us of that ability to be quite so intensive in our pressing in the midfield, and that's exactly the area that you don't want to allow Leicester time on the ball and the ability to start to dictate the tempo, which is what they then did.
I think that point about time on the ball is absolutely right. I think Diallo, no doubt has the makings of a very good player, but he's not there yet. And I think not only did his early booking not rule him out, but counter his defensive abilities, but he lacks the kind of one-touch pass that Romeo and Ward-Prowse specialise in. He does often take a couple of touches or likes to turn with the ball. And I think it means that the Saints aren't breaking forward as quickly and aren't getting ends involved.
It's interesting. If you watch Diallo when he was at Brest, which I did a little bit on video before he joined us, he was used more as a press-resistant, ball-carrying midfielder. Like, not all of the time. I'm not talking that, he was some kind of Mr. Dembele character, but I think his game in France was certainly tempered to do that, and he he likes to take that additional touch to see if he can then burst forwards and carry the ball a little bit further. But I agree, what that means is that you don't necessarily get... I think it's interesting. It actually probably affects us more in terms of the ability to recycle possession from a cul-de-sac. I'm not so worried about the ability to transition forward, but one of the things that Romeo does really well is judge situations when Southampton are heading into an area where they're not going to progress the ball that well, and quickly returning it to the centre-backs or to the full-backs. And I think Diallo is more forward-thinking and is more interested in seeking to progress the ball, which sometimes means that we end up losing it in a position where we can ill afford to, because there's the opportunity for the opposition to then transition quickly.
Yeah, it's sort of a weird one, because I don't think necessarily when Romeo sort of went out on injured for a long while that I would have thought it would have actually impacted our attacking play quite so much. But it is it does, for those reasons that you've said, has made a difference, really. I just didn't think sort of Romeo would be sort of an important attacking cog, and it sort of turns out that way in his absence that you can see that's happened. And actually, when Diallo first sort of broke in on the scene, it was sort of that ball carrying ability, that, as you described, the press resistant ball carrying ability that he did quite well in his first few games, which I think certainly took me by surprise that he was able to do that so young and so inexperienced in the Premier League. In the first half as well, we had a few chances for Leicester. Benrek and Forster did quite well in blocking out a Leicester chance. Vardy had quite a good chance bearing down over on Forster, but sort of sliced it wide. And then I thought the best opportunity for Saints was Danny Ings had the ball approaching the edge of the area, and it looked like he might take quite an early shot, which would have been from some distance, but certainly not something that he's not done without success before. But he sort of tried to carry it on a bit, played for the foul, I think hoping to get James Ward-Prowse free kick, and didn't get it. His sort of dive wasn't quite good enough. That sort of frustrated me a little bit, because I think if we think back to early Saints this season and Danny Ings on form, I think he would have hit that and certainly tested the keeper, and it sort of pointed to a whole overall sort of quite cautious approach to the game, I thought.
I think that's one of the two reasons that we were so significantly overperforming expected goals in the first half of the season, or first third of the season, or partly because James Ward-Prowse's ability from direct free kicks and also to create headed opportunities for players means that, and I think we talked about this on the last pod, it creates opportunities of a significantly lower XG, but because it's a deliberate game plan, it was kind of sustainable. But the other way that we would do that is the Danny Ings snapshot, that ability that he has to hit a quick shot from a slightly unexpected location. I mean, I've not gone back and checked the video, but I suspect if you looked at Ings's goals, at least half of them would pass at least one defender on the way in. And I can certainly remember several instances where he's hit it through really two or three defenders, and that's because he shoots when defenders aren't expecting it. They want, or that they're assuming he's going to take another touch. And it felt like a kind of a regression to the Ings of maybe a season or two before, where there was less of that instinctive, I'm just going to go for it now because it's the right moment, or maybe a greater degree of caution. I'm not entirely sure, but you're right. I think it's something where if that opportunity had happened at the beginning of the season, he would have shot much, much sooner. Not that necessarily yields a goal, but I think there's been a change in the style for some reason there.
Yeah, and just generally, I think Saints are sort of taking less risks and being less opportunistic as well. So if we then move on to the second half, I suppose at half-time, I was probably quite pleased to be 0-0 because we hadn't really had an awful lot, and Leicester hadn't had an awful lot for us to be hugely worried about. And I thought at the start of the second half, we looked a little bit more lively, perhaps for the first 5-6 minutes. But then we have the situation of Bednarek, who had been tested a few times by Vardy already on the left wing. Vardy gets past Bednarek and puts a cross in, which leads to a dreadful shot from Iheanacho, which is going so far wide it hits Vestergaard, who's sort of not really in a great position to try and stop Iheanacho, and then bounces back to him and he puts his second shot in. It was a dreadful goal to concede. It was horrible.
Yeah, I think Saints need to have a talk about Bednarek, and the loyalty shown to Bednarek is admirable, but people have worked him out, haven't they? Which is, you drag him high up the pitch and you try and turn him, and he's not fast enough to make up the ground. And Vardy did it. They did it to him a couple of times, and it was just an awful goal to concede. It was like a horribly calamitous, stupid goal. Which I don't understand. We bought Salisu because he reads the game really well and he's fast. And we've got instead we're playing two very ponderous centre backs who have their own strengths, but Vestergaard is like an oil tanker. And it was you could just see that it obviously worked out. They're going to play off Bednarek, and they got it right, and they scored a goal.
It's also, I completely agree, and I'm persistently baffled with the lack of opportunity that Salisu's had. But also, this is something that if you play against Leicester, will happen. I mean, the number of times we did a Tifo video on when Jamie Vardy scored his 100th Premier League goal. Was it 100 or 100th top senior goal or whatever it was? I can't remember. And I watched all of them, and the number of times that he peels off onto that left-hand side, takes the ball, and then runs on an angled run in towards goal, attacking the space in between the fullback, who's usually too high, and the centre-back, who's usually been dragged up a little bit. It's like Vardy 101, that opportunity. And often he actually shoots himself and does well. But here, Iheanacho's been a threat all season too, so I don't think it was a huge surprise that those two combined. But like Tom says, not only have Leicester recognised a weakness of Southampton's that they can exploit, but I think Southampton failed to counteract what is obviously a Leicester strength with those typical Vardy runs. It's quite disappointing.
Yeah, and I suppose at this point, this is where you now expect Saints to sort of try and go for some sort of blood and guts. You're in the semi-final. There's nothing to lose, really, is there? You've got to go for it. We see Adams coming on for Redmond. I'll bring all of the subs in at this point, actually, and then we'll talk about sort of perhaps the opportunities for Saints. But we have Adams on for Redmond in the 58th minute, Walcott on for Gineppe in the 73rd minute, and then Salisu and Teller on in the 85th minute. We didn't really get any blood and guts, I don't think. We had two shots from Diallo. The first one just after Adams came on, which was sort of quite a long-range speculative shot. The second one was sort of that achingly close volley. What a goal that could have been. And that's, maybe we can talk about it for a moment, because that was literally all we had. And then, I suppose James Maddison had a shot in acres of space, but really there was nothing more of note for Saints, just nothing. And I think that's probably the thing which I'm most upset about, is just how little we threw into this game in terms of that sort of level of effort. And it sort of didn't seem to occur to the players how important this game might be, or certainly, or to Ralph, I don't know. I mean, I just feel a bit of at a loss. I'm just really sad about it.
I'm always inclined to be, I think, more generous to players in terms of how they view games. I don't think there would be any Southampton players who weren't conscious of the importance of it. I just feel like with the season having gone the way it has, with such a bright positive start falling away again. Very poor results. Let's not go into the specifics. Coming off the back of that West Brom defeat, and also just being really threadbare. Like I never felt there was going to be another gear that Southampton could go into. I think even if they desperately wanted to throw everything at Leicester, and let's also bear in mind that Leicester had their first choice defensive three for the first time in ages. You know, Fofana is an exceptional player. Johnny Evans is hugely experienced. Soyuncu is athletic and poses a threat carrying the ball forwards as well. So, you know, they're playing against a really good defence who are finally back together again. But I just felt like Southampton looked weary. I mean, really, really weary. And I would never wish to say that it's because the players don't care. I mean, I think this season has been so odd and so busy and has so many external stresses on it. And when you add in the psychological impact of how topsy-turvy it's been for Southampton this season, I just think you're looking at a squad that's completely spent.
Yeah, I think mentally as well, they look broken, don't they? They look...
I think I mean more mental than physical, if anything, actually. Yeah.
They look completely devoid of joy. I mean, if we look at the results really since the Liverpool game in the league, what's it, 2 wins? Sheffield United, the worst, one of the worst teams ever playing in the Premier League, and admittedly a very good comeback against Burnley. But in those times, there's been very little joy. Danny Ings' goal against Burnley was probably, you'd say, is about it. And they just look demotivated. I think as well, the club, when the post-mortem of this season is, and hopefully, I think we'll still be in the Premier League. If we do get relegated, then we truly are. We've really, that's the story for the ages. But I think the club has got some really tough decisions to make. I think, if you start to look at the players that played on Saturday, I mean, Bertrand, for me, it is one of the fascinating things of this season. Bertrand looks still fit as a butcher's dog, but those sort of lung-busting runs that that was such an important outlet for us with Nathan Redmond, ball down the channel. It's just when was the last time you really saw one? And I think kind of the Rowan Bertrand thing is almost like a microcosm of Saints' season, which is like there's someone there that did something that was so important, and it's just not happening. And it doesn't, it's just not happening for any of them, really. Stuart Armstrong is probably about the only one you could say at the moment is actually playing well. Even Carl Walker-Peters looks like people have got his number. They just looked so fatigued, but you just felt they just wanted that final whistle.
Yeah, they I mean, that's just a crazy idea though, isn't it? That they sort of want to be off. I mean, I totally agree with both of you that they look mentally broken. I think they look devoid of ideas, and that whole idea about it being joyless as well is quite an interesting one, because I think when you are feeling confident and sparking bright or whatever, that is when you take chances, and then some of those chances come off and you win games, and we're not seeing that. And then the other thing as well, which I've noticed probably since that Liverpool win, and as we've sort of dipped down the table and our form and performances have dipped as well, is Ralph on the touchline seems to be a slightly different demeanour as well. I think probably in the first half of the season, he sort of seemed like quite a big presence, very vocal presence on the touchline, and almost like he was playing every ball, every header, every pass, commanding his players at every single moment. And when things start to go wrong, you almost start to see him shrink a little bit at the side of the pitch, which just doesn't really seem to suit Ralph at all. And I think, some of our listeners have noted this as well. So I've had quite a few people message me on Twitter and a couple of emails as well. And some of our fans are really starting to question whether Ralph is still the right man for the job, which, again, back in those heady days, when you were first on the podcast, Alex, we wouldn't have, we just thought how lucky we are to have Ralph. And in such a short period of time for so many fans And I don't know whether this is a vocal minority or if there's a sort of wider feeling about it, but it certainly feels like it's a growing number. But there are fans that are questioning whether Ralph is still the right man for the job. And I wonder, what's the answer?
The answer is that the squad needs to be bigger and stronger. I mean, if you hire a manager like Hasenhüttl, who's come through the Red Bull system, who plays a high pressing, pretty vertical brand of football, then you know that the squad is going to get worn out. And if you look at the substitutes, effectively you've got a reserve striker in this instance in Adams. You've got Walcott, who I agree has brought some leadership and some experience, but is 31 and is on loan. You've then got two centre-backs, Salas, who I really like. Stevens, I think, has his place in the squad. But after that, you're basically looking at youth players again. The whole of the rest of it is pretty much youth players. There's no, unless you want to swap out a left winger or a striker, there isn't any scope to play with this team. There isn't any opportunity to mix things up tactically, to inject something different in the course of a game. These players all do roughly similar things, even the attacking players. And so I think the combination of some of these results, the fragility within the squad, the lack of leadership, the lack of experience among a lot of the players, I think, I suppose what I mean is that Ralph Hasenhüttl is a really good coach. He is trying perhaps to do things with the squad that they are currently not capable of sustaining across the course of a whole league season. That is not uncommon for coaches to play football the way that he does. And ordinarily, the teams that succeed with that are ones that have a stronger, deeper squad. So either you get in a more conservative manager who plays a more pedestrian style of football, in which case I think you lose out on the opportunity of having a genuinely great coach, or you actually back him and I'm not being one of those fans who's like, oh, the board needs to spend money, because that's, you have to spend money the right way. Spending money for its own sake is not a good idea. But you can't rationally expect to play the way that Ralph wants the team to play through a whole season with a squad that is this thin. It just doesn't work. So I'm not saying that, you go out and sign the 5 best players in the world. We have to be realistic about what Southampton's financial clout is, its ability to sell itself as a football club as well, the emphasis on bringing younger players through. And there are some good young players in there, people like Smallbone, Jankovic. But you also need to be sensible about what you're asking your players to be able to do and what you're asking your coach to get those players to do. And there is an irreconcilable imbalance at the moment between that and how the squad is created.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, even you start to look at some of the decisions made this year, and what's happened this season in terms of everyone knew, this was a compressed season with little pre-season, same number of games. Everyone knew this. And Saints have made some baffling decisions to weaken their squad. And I know that he's not the future of the football club, but look at someone like Shane Long. I'd argue, in a season like this, was getting rid of Shane Long the right answer? Probably not. Was, for a team whose fullbacks are so important, was letting the 2 reserve fullbacks go out on loan, leaving them with 0 cover?
It was absolute idiocy to do that. I mean, irresponsible to do that.
But this is the thing, and it's, I think the Shane Long point, I know that he's not, he's never going to win us the Premier League, but we need to, what he does do is he's a pain in the arse, and he stretches games and he makes life difficult, and he's experienced, he's a leader. And I think with Saints, I think there's another point about Ward-Prowse, and he's a brilliant professional. He's clearly inspirational and fantastic, but is he the captain that this team needs? You know, is he gonna drag those players up? And I think there's too many, for me, players who almost wear their heart on their sleeves. And, you know, whenever you go and watch Saints in the flesh, you watch Nathan Redmond. And that's the great thing about watching football in the flesh and not on camera, is you watch players, what they do. And Nathan Redmond, if it's not going for him, will throw his hands in the air and he'll bawl and he'll scream at people. Bertrand, terrible body language. Bednarek, I think, has the look of a defeated man. And I just don't think, maybe it's a Romeu thing without Romeu, but they just don't seem to be able to, once a decision has gone against them, or once the gods have conspired against them, they don't seem to be able to pick themselves back up.
I wonder too whether Ward-Prowse has a bit too much responsibility at the moment. I mean, you know, captain, there's a lot made of the set piece delivery stuff being potentially Southampton's major option, which is never a situation you want to be in unless you're FC Midtjylland. He also has to do with the absence of, you know, a very solid and vastly experienced colleague in central midfield. And I agree with, you know, Diallo. I think Diallo was a shrewd acquisition, but he was an acquisition to develop over a season, not to throw into first team action towards the tail end with the expectation that he would start a run of games. I don't think anybody would have bought him for that intention. So I think Ward-Prowse he's probably reached that stage where he feels like in a team that is lacking leadership, he's just got too much on his plate. He can't do everything in central midfield and be the major goal threat and be the captain and try and carry a group of players who are exhausted and probably quite miserable in some instances, or inexperienced and worried about their future and all of this kind of stuff. It's not, and I say this with no disrespect, but he doesn't seem like a big character. He's not one of those captains who seems extremely vocal and shouty. He leads by example. But I think Southampton need more of that. I mean, Ryan Bertrand he's a very cerebral character. He thinks a lot about football. He understands the tactical side of the game very, very well. But again, he's a lead by example kind of player. And I think he's in a tricky position from a tactical perspective. His runs, I don't think he's making them because he's having to be much more cautious now. I think that's part of the problem, that without that cover ahead and inside of him, he can't go on these lung bursting runs quite so often, because Southampton could be picked apart in transition if he gets too high up the field. So he's naturally pushing himself forwards in quite the same way, and it has this kind of knock-on effect. It's all these tiny intangibles that make it very hard to say, well, there's a clear and obvious solution, and the clear and obvious solution is to do X, because I don't think there is one. I think you can see a variety of ways that things can improve, but I think more than anything, I think we're safe. You know, we're that there's a sufficient gap between us and the relegation zone for that not to be a massive issue. But I think the end of the season needs to come, and I hope that Southampton have planned and thought very, very hard about the acquisitions they're going to make during the summer, because they'll be absolutely crucial.
I think, sorry, John, just one more thing on that point about strange decisions. One of the strangest things for me over the last 6 weeks or so has been the decision to sideline Che Adams, about the last month or so. We've got if you look at our forward line, if you look at Redmond, Walcott and Moussa Jeffo are three of the kind of most mercurial, is a nice way to put it, but wildly inconsistent is probably the more realistic footballers you'll ever see. All of them capable of brilliance, but none of them have ever been able to, and Moussa's very young, admittedly. Redmond's still got a lot of game time. Walcott's had a fantastic career, but none of them are consistent, and none of them seem like the right answer to the question. And I just don't understand why. If you look at the way we played against Leicester, where we ended up just pumping the ball up long, and the Leicester centre-backs all day, Danny Ings is not great in the air. We're all day just gobbling that ball up and recycling it to the very talented Leicester midfield, who outnumbered ours. And, what's Adams done wrong to not... Yeah, Adams was playing really well. He was the only one who was scoring any goals. And now he's a substitute when you've got Walcott, who scored 2 all season. Redmond has scored 2 in the league all season. Musa has scored 1 in the league all season.
Yeah, I wonder whether it's to do with protecting midfield, though. If you have 2 out-and-out strikers who are going to press as high as Ings and Adams were pressing at the start of the season, that does leave quite a gap to... I mean, I know Ings could drop off and press from behind as well, which I feel like maybe it's a slightly conciliatory thing done in order to protect that central midfield a little bit more, try and have a little bit more pace, but also a player who is slightly more inclined to play a little bit deeper and just try to give the midfield slightly more cover. I mean, I agree, it's a conservative move, and against Leicester, your best opportunity is to press them high and to try and disrupt their ability to build out from the back. But I'm guessing that's the rationale. I don't know, though.
Yeah, it's some very strange decisions this season. I think the loaning out the right back and left back backup options was just crazy, suicidal in some ways, especially when Carl Walker-Peters got injured so soon after that happened. I mean, I think in response to the original question, is Ralph still the right man for the job? Alex, am I right in sort of reading between the lines and you think Ralph is a football manager that you or a football coach that you greatly admire, and his way of playing football does work, but you must provide the correct tools for it to happen? Is that right?
Completely. There is no coincidence that the Red Bull infrastructure is created to provide not only a coaching pipeline, but a player pipeline of players that are schooled in this system, in the kind of pressing, rapid transitions, verticality. You get it whether you're playing at FC Liefering or whether you're at Salzburg or you're at Leipzig, and New York as well, obviously, and myriad other clubs, no doubt. And that is a way of ensuring not just that there's a deep enough squad to be able to play that style of football, but also that the players that are coming into the team are capable of doing it and have it almost as a second nature, by and large. We have seen these kind of coaches struggle in first, second season in the Premier League. Klopp had the same issues at Liverpool when he was trying to get that style of pressing in. Admittedly, it was a slightly different form of pressing, but it takes time for these methods to work. It also takes a greater degree of physical and mental resilience. But no, I don't fault the manager. I absolutely would keep him 100%, and I also don't really blame the players for it.
Tom, is that your opinion as well, or are you starting to doubt Ralph?
My concern with Ralph is a great manager, and I agree. I think the point is correct, which is he's a technician, isn't he? And if you take but he's a specialist technician, needs a certain set of tools, and Saints haven't given him beyond what he needs immediately. They've not given him more, and in a season like this, you need more. My concern with it is like whether he seems to have the passion for it. He seems to. He talked, a couple of weeks ago about staying at Saints for another 3 years, and that's great. But I think, we talked about everything from the team, the club, the bottom up. The under-23s have lost 7-1 to Leicester tonight. My concern is it working? Don't doubt he's great, but is it working? And I think one of the things, and I think this is, this will be down to lack of squad, but we have no plan B. Nothing. And so many times this season, and I've said this before, and it's not a particularly original thought from me. Other people have said it, but part of the problem is Saints lose a lot of games from winning positions. They lose a lot of games from winning positions because other managers see what's going wrong and they change it to counteract what Saints are doing. Saints then lose games. We go behind. We just play the same game. But it doesn't matter who we're playing, what the score is, how far we're into the game. We generally just play exactly the same game with exactly the same set of players. And I wonder if there's a tactical inflexibility there, but also the fact that he has no real, as I understand it, no real number two at the club. And is there anyone there to speak truth to power and to sort of, 60 minutes into a game? So you've got to make these subs now. That was one of the only positive things we saw in the FA Cup semi-final was we made a sub quickly after going behind. But I don't know. My worry is does Ralph leaving look like, and if he goes to the right club, does it look like no one loses face?
Well, there's a big old reshuffle happening in Germany, isn't there? And obviously with the European Super League occurring, German clubs have said they're not going into it. It does potentially make Jurgen Klopp's position at Liverpool interesting, given his outstated opposition to the ESL. But Hansi Flick is leaving Bayern. Nagelsmann, therefore, is available for a price, but probably would move to Bayern. That would leave a vacancy at Leipzig. Would Jesse Marsch move to Leipzig? Or is he a sufficiently attractive proposition potentially for a Premier League side? If the Leipzig vacancy is open, then it would be quite in their character to potentially bring Hasenhüttl back. There's the Bundesliga likes coaches that have Bundesliga experience, and there is potentially, it's a very attractive proposition. It's a more attractive proposition than Southampton, let's be honest. So I don't know. It could be one of those. It could be like when Mourinho left Real Madrid for Chelsea the second time round. Basically, everybody wanted the move to happen, so they cancelled any kind of fee for it because it just suited all of the parties to get that move done. Possibly, you could see a similar sort of situation happening. I think it would be a real shame, because I also then, the thing I worry more about, yes, obviously I would worry about losing a coach of Hasenhüttl's calibre, but I think Southampton have been really quite hit and miss in terms of managerial appointments. If you look at, sort of the post-Atkins era, there have been a couple of successes and there have been a couple of abject failures and there have been a couple in between. And I don't have a huge amount of confidence in the board to necessarily appoint a good sort of semi-continuity manager, somebody who can embrace the aspects of the Hasenhüttl regime that worked well, maybe temper some of the ones that didn't work so well. And I take on point about the fact that, this idea of rolling up a blueprint across the whole club, I think that's still very much a work in progress, and it's impossible to judge it as a success at this point in time. So, yeah, there probably is work that could be done to improve that sort of thing. But, you look at the board and think, are they going to pick the right guy for the job, particularly given other of the decisions around transfers and loan signings and so on that have been so badly ballsed up?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of feel like we're in a little bit of a catch-22 situation here, whereas, we've got Ralph Hasenhüttl, who is a specific manager for a sort of specific squad size and type. And, yes, he's a good manager. Yes, we can see how well it works. The way we were playing at the start of the season, the way that we played during Project Restart last season, we've got a glimmer, a good idea of what a successful or a functioning Ralph Hasenhüttl side looks like, and it's a wonderful, beautiful thing to behold. And I'd take that any day of the week. But is Southampton ever going to give Ralph the correct tools for him to be able to do that job consistently? I don't know. I think that's a question that probably the board need to answer. And then if we're not going to do that, then do we go back to having a slightly more pragmatic approach, at least perhaps to the first team? If he is here for the long term and he is going to build the youth teams around his style of play, and then that's going to generate the young players to bring in and it will work, that's all going to take an awful lot of time. Does he therefore need to be a little bit more pragmatic perhaps with the first team and make sure that we do have a plan B or some slightly different variations? I mean, I think probably the closest we've got to a plan B is when he went for the sort of the 3-4-3 right at the end in the 85th minute with those subs of Slisa and Teller coming on. I mean, it didn't really make a noticeable difference, I don't think, in terms of us creating any more particularly good chances. But I think there's probably more questions than answers, I think, to this whole area and topic, and I almost feel like it's something that we could go on and on about. So, Tom and Alex, do you want to have your last words on this, and then we'll move on to the joy that is the European Super League?
I guess my last word will be that I think the summer is going to be crucial. I think you're absolutely right that when a Ralph team is playing well and playing properly and adhering to his principles, it's fantastic. It's not currently sustainable. It could be made sustainable if the right player acquisitions are made over the summer, but I have limited confidence in that happening. So we shall see.
Yeah, I mean, I think the club are managing expectation, aren't they, with the signings? They're talking about no more than £10 million. One of the things that was being rumoured, and that puts us in a kind of a bracket of we have to unearth brilliant players that no one else has thought of signing. A world which are few and far between.
I mean, I'm happy to step up and do it if anyone's seen our sensible transfer series.
I'll do it for a 10% cut of any transfer fee. But
I would do it for the love of the game.
But it's if you look at our recruitment is bad, and it's a really good point. We've not often got it right in recent seasons, and we're still paying for that. The lack of squad this year is not due to Ralph. It's due to the decisions of the Wesley Hoyts, the Aldianusis, the Carrillos. That's we are still paying the bills.
Yeah, absolutely.
To extent, the Bufals. We went big. We signed terrible players. We wasted the Van Dijk money to £1, and that now it seems mad to think about it, but that is our chaos theory, isn't it? That is the butterfly flaps its wings and there's a hurricane somewhere in the world. Is that we signed really bad players at really inflated wages that no one else wants, and we've seen Lazio saying they're not going to take up Hoyt. Fulham are probably going to get relegated, so we'll see the lovely smirking Mario Lemina back at St Mary's, and these are players that at their wages no one wants.
Yeah, we're the budget Barcelona.
Yeah,
it's when they blew the Neymar money. It's the same thing.
We're going to have what's that, Hoyt and Lemina. Now I don't know what players are on, but I bet that's 120 grand a week now coming back to Saints. £6 million a calendar year on those two players, and we can't ship them out. And I think this summer is really important. But my concern is if we don't, other teams are strengthening and other teams are recruiting really well. Just look at Leicester and the players they've signed, like Fofana. These players are brilliant, and we're not. And I think the problem is we're not standing still, but we're walking, and a lot of other teams are running, and we're going to struggle.
I think Leicester's a fantastic analogue there because, granted, Leicester obviously won the Premier League, but what catapulted them to that was unearthing a couple of players in Ligue 2, in Mahrez and Kante, also obviously Vardy from non-league. Really shrewd acquisitions that were made with limited outlay. And what they've done is they've scaled that up, but continued to be sensible. You know, Castagnier from Atalanta, fantastic signing. Fofana from Saint-Etienne, fantastic signing. Like, the amount of money they're able to spend is a little bit more than it was, but they've not gone wild on anybody. They've not massively overspent on anybody. They took a punt on Iheanacho as a cast-off from Man City, and he's now scored, 10 in 7, something like that.
Yeah, 15 season for Iheanacho.
Right. So I'd like to say that I did, at the beginning of the season, call him as a player to watch on the Tifo podcast. I think the idea of with the tools that are available these days in terms of video scouting, in terms of data, in terms of the breadth of availability of league information, yes, it's still difficult to find amazing players, but you only need to find 2 or 3 or 4 who are undervalued, who the market hasn't noticed, to be able to make relatively good, astute, potentially transformational signings. I think Diallo is in that model, but you're absolutely right. You know, the list of players that we've got very badly wrong is much, much, much bigger than the list of players we've got right. And the club really needs to look at its recruitment process because it has not been good.
And also just on that Leicester point, credit to them, because when they've had to sell, which they did with Maguire, they sold big and they reinvested that money in better, arguably, I have very strong feelings about Harry Maguire, how good he is, but they've invested it across the team, made the entire team better. And that is something Saints just seem chronically incapable of doing over the last few years.
So, Alex, I think we've got you on record here saying that you're just going to do it for the love of the game, but you're going to pull together a sensible transfers for Southampton and send that to the club's hierarchy, and obviously give the Saints FC podcast an exclusive look at that as well. Is that what I heard?
Absolutely right. Yeah.
Okay.
I to be honest, it's the kind of thing I would love to do almost as a purely intellectual exercise. But yeah, there are clearly things that that need to be done in terms of the process and also in terms of the end result. Because players like Guido Carrillo should not be getting through the filter. So yeah, it's a shame when you see other clubs, like Tom said, other clubs making strides in this department, and Southampton very much standing still.
So let's move on to the European Super League, which I think, interestingly, from the whole transfer point of view, is there might be a lot of caution, I think, in their sort of transfer policy of clubs like Southampton, because, well, A, COVID and all the lost revenue, but B, European Super League and the big 6 clubs potentially leaving the Premier League, which may, and I know that's not the current proposal, but it may end up happening, but they're certainly looking to suck more of the television subscription money away from the other 14 clubs in the Premier League and all the other clubs in the football pyramid, and have more of it for themselves. So, I mean, who wants to give us... Everyone's aware of what the European Super League is, right? So the big 6 clubs, they want to go and form a special league, play midweek. I think they I'm not 100% on all the details, but presumably this will be to the detriment of some of the domestic midweek competitions. Certainly the Champions League and Europa League, I think, would have to make way for this. And what are we left with? I mean, Tom, Alex, do you have particularly strong feelings about this proposal?
Yeah, it's disgusting naked capitalism, and the people involved should be booted out of football forever.
Oh, I like that. That's,
Think, Alex.
Say
what you think.
Don't sit on the fence.
Come on.
I don't. I mean, okay. Let's be honest. Football has been moving in this direction for a long, long time, and this is the opportunity to choose between one set of really bad guys and another set of really bad guys, right? So it's not like these clubs are somehow juxtaposed against the forces of righteousness. insofar as there are forces of righteousness in football, it's fan groups and the occasional, fan-owned club. But this is the greater of two evils. By creating a financial hegemony within that group of clubs, the amounts of money being discussed are eye-watering in the billions. JP Morgan have agreed to finance it, according to Reuters. It would create a tier of clubs that were basically ungovernable, effectively, by UEFA or by FIFA, because they would have too much money. They would have too much legal clout. They could basically act with impunity and do what they liked, as they are doing. And it remains to be seen whether there'll be a sufficient appetite or capability for a legal challenge from UEFA. I mean, Ceferin is lobbying very hard for this, but who knows whether it'll happen. FIFA will cave on the World Cup, because I think that the likelihood of FIFA actually not admitting players from European Super League clubs to play in the World Cup is ludicrous. That FIFA would not devalue their prime commodity by such an extent that you'd get rid of France, you'd get rid of England, Italy. You'd have quite a few of the German national team, but still not all of them. It's like that's not going to happen. So it's greed. It's just. I mean, when it came out yesterday, there was, again, in our little Tifo WhatsApp group, there were kind of rumors of this thing, and then it wasn't really until the English clubs started tweeting that it was the case. And, I think Arsenal were probably the first one to say we are a founder member of the new European Super League. And there was just like disbelief, it's how can a club so nakedly trample on the concern and the interests of their own fans? How can they put so much more interest and stock in the potential for broadcasting revenue than what the fans of their own club want? Potentially jeopardize their place in the domestic game, potentially jeopardize their players' opportunity to play in the Euros, potentially jeopardize their ability to win anything other than this new competition, which has no history, has no standing, is of limited interest to 99% of football fans. That's probably not very coherent, but I'm quite angry about it.
I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here and suggest that sort of weren't Southampton sort of complicit in the start of all of this happening anyway? I mean, if you look at clubs further down the footballing pyramid in England, they suffered this exact same thing, 27-ish years ago, I guess nearly 30 years ago now, with the formation of the Premier League. That
absolutely
funneling of money away from the 92 to a much smaller group. That's
why I said that this is not a set of bad guys and a set of good guys. Everybody is complicit. If you have a Sky Sports subscription, you are complicit. If you have a BT Sports subscription, you are relatively complicit. Like this is the way football has been going for decades, and it has now reached. I mean, I suppose it's great that people are now angry about it, and this is ultimately a kind of disaster capitalism, isn't it? That these clubs have moved at the point that they have to because everybody else is weakened, and they are also weakened because of the pandemic. So they have the financial reality of needing this additional money, and other people aren't really in a position to fight them as hard as they would have been pre-COVID. But I think the hand-wringing from the football infrastructure, whether it's UEFA or FIFA or the other 14 clubs in the Premier League or whatever, is effectively pretty hypocritical. I mean, what do we have if we don't have the European Super League? We have the Swiss model for the Champions League, which has an expanded format, has this weird league structure, and is just another way of seeking to funnel more money to a certain number of teams. You'll always get the same platitudes that it's going to create greater trickle-down wealth and it's going to benefit everybody. And it's bollocks. It's not going to happen. The only saving grace here is that there are enough fans. This is such a momentous hiatus. And I don't remember 92 particularly well, so it probably felt as big. But there's something about this one. Maybe it's because we are also more clued up to the evils of this kind of neoliberal globalization that we've been going through, that people are more upset and angry and on edge about things that undermine community, because that's one of the few good things that's come out of the pandemic is the role of community. And in some instances, absolutely kudos to individual football clubs, including Liverpool and Manchester United, for the way that they helped during the pandemic. It would be stupid to deny that as well. But I think people are feeling particularly sore about certain things at the moment, particularly angry about certain things. And this has come at the moment of political awareness, of anger, of all sorts of other things that just makes this one feel like the one that will either change a lot of stuff or will effectively, I guess, destroy football as we know it.
Okay, so here's another question, all right? And I think it's going to be quite interesting as well to hear our listeners' thoughts on this, because we have a lot of listeners who are not based in Southampton, not geographically linked to Southampton Football Club, and tune in from all parts of the world. And I wonder if perhaps those who are geographically dislocated from the clubs that they support as fans are maybe going to feel a little bit more positive about this, because what difference does it make to your average American football fan of Manchester United or Chinese fan of Liverpool about whether they're playing in a European Super League or a Premier League? And I wonder what the sort of American and Chinese and Australian Saints fans think about the European Super League, and whether that's going to differ from those who are linked to the city. Because what I think is quite interesting is when you have a football club which has sort of grown up around a community, it's like it's a geographical thing. It's very much tied to the area. And then it becomes sold to a Russian oligarch or an American businessman or a Saudi prince or whatever. And then that club is owned. Should football clubs be able to be owned by any individual or private business? That's maybe a broader question. But there's been a whole level going away from football clubs being community things that are located within a city and part of that city. And I think MK Dons is a perfect example of that on a sort of lower scale. But football's been going in this sort of direction, and I think it asks a lot of deeper philosophical questions, one of which is, does the match-going fan mean anything to a football club? Maybe in Southampton it does, because there's still a significant amount of the income. But to a club like Manchester United or Liverpool, I don't know. They probably have platitudes towards their fans that show up at Old Trafford or Anfield, but the reality is they'd much rather serve the tens of millions of fans elsewhere who've got more money and more collective buying power.
Sorry, just very quick on that. You have to look at the timing of the announcement. Right, the timing of the announcement tells you everything about who it's targeted at, and I think it was targeted for the Eastern Seaboard of the US, which tells you this is not about Europe. It's about the US. And on that point about community, the weirdest thing to me is this has taken so long. I don't know what's taken them so long. I think there's 3 points because I think Alex has done it more eloquently than I can. But one, it cements these 15 in the league, and then double cements their place because of the increased revenue. So therefore there's no way anyone can, so not only they can't be moved, there's no way anyone can ever catch them ever again. But then there's the point about what this actually is, which is they know they're not going to do it. In my view, this is a negotiating tactic, and they do this now. There's loads of outrage. They don't do it eventually, but they gain concessions. And this is a negotiating tactic, and they're testing the water. And I think that this will come, and I hope, I'd love to see the Premier League and see the FA, whatever influence they have, to boot them out. I think it would be brilliant. I don't think for 1 second they'd ever have the guts to do it, or that maybe even the legal right to do it. But this is a thin end. This is kind of like the thin end of the wedge. And what this will create is just such a power imbalance that it means that no one will ever be able to compete. And then once the genie's out of the bottle, you can't put it back in. And yeah, it's a horrible, disgusting announcement. The people who run the clubs involved should be ashamed of themselves. Liverpool should be ashamed. Man United should be ashamed because they're great football clubs. Arsenal and Spurs should be ashamed because they're having the balls to call themselves Super League clubs when in the positions they're in. And I think it's just a terrible, and also just the timing, isn't it? Like, what awful after the world has been through in the last sort of 15 months, and this is how you do it. It's just everything about it, the logo, everything about it is awful. And I really hope they throw the book at them for it.
I have to say, I would like you to be right, Tom, but I think this is happening. And I think the fact that the clubs have openly committed to it on social media and on the various channels, the fact that the website is up, the fact that the branding, which I agree is legitimately unpleasant to look at, is all up there. I think this has passed beyond a bargaining chip. I think the fact that the Swiss model was going to be agreed, the fact that these guys, Glazer, Agnelli, Woodward, etc., have all walked away from the roles that they held at either UEFA or the ECA, means that we've gone past brinkmanship. I absolutely agree that's why it was being done in the past, but I think they've just got tired. I think also with the financial clout that they have and the backing of an investment bank, they know that they can take this on. They know that the Euros it's too soon to the Euros for there to be any significant action in that time. It's far enough away from the World Cup for FIFA to be able to climb down. And I don't think it's the thin end of the wedge. I think it's sort of, I suppose the way I would put it is more that, like I said, this is what things have been building towards for a long time. And there is nothing to say that in the next sort of 3 or 4 years, we won't start to see the expansion of this Super League into, a couple of South American clubs, a couple of Mexican clubs, a couple of Chinese clubs potentially. I think there's one word of caution that I would offer, which is that I don't blame any of the fans of these clubs that aren't local to the club themselves. And I have seen some takes on this which frankly border on the xenophobic, about Indian fans here or Chinese fans there. And I think it's important to recognize that everybody has a legitimate right to support the club that they choose to support. And that might be the club that's 5 minutes down the road, and it might be a club that's 5,000 miles away. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. What is wrong is the clubs themselves turning their back on any group of supporters. There is no requirement for the clubs to do this in order to satisfy one group or another. They can very, very easily sustain the fans that turn up in stadiums and also provide a good experience and a good fan experience to fans that live in Shanghai or Delhi or New York. This is about clubs wanting to make more money and to make sure that nobody else can come into a position that threatens their ability to make that money. And that is what this is wrong.
There we go. Listeners, I'd be really keen to hear your thoughts on this. You know the email, it's saintsfcpodcast@gmail.com. We're also on Twitter @saintsfcpodcast. Do you agree with Alex? Do you agree with Tom? What do you think is going to happen of this? There is like one little part of me that maybe hopes that and I'm going to spell out a sort of utopia that's probably not going to happen, but if these 6 clubs did, go off, do their own thing, and then we sort of had a slightly more level playing field as the top division in England, whatever you call it. I'm trying to think of a future sort of halcyon days where safe standing is regular, Saints are competitive in a league where most of the teams are sort of similar levels, and some of the perhaps things that I enjoyed when I'd go through my sort of glossy rose tinted glasses to my history of watching football come back. But that's probably not going to happen. I think we know the direction that football's going in, and it's sort of inevitable that it continues on that path. Alex, thank you so much for joining us again. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast, and great to know that there's some Saints supporters out there doing interesting things in the world of sort of football content and media. Obviously, if you want to see more of Alex, look out for Tifo Football, their podcast, their videos on Twitter and in The Athletic. Tom, it's always a pleasure to have you on the podcast. So, gents, thank you very much. Once again, the only thing for us to do now is say bye-bye to our listeners. So thank you, listeners. Cheerio.
Cheerio. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Good night.